This is GPS, the Global Public Square. Welcome to all of you in the United States and around the world. I'm Zakaria, coming to you live from New York. Today on the program,
we'll fight this variant with science and speed, not chaos and confusion.
As Omicron entered our lexicon and our world, dozens of countries shut down their borders, especially from travel originating in Africa. Across that continent, less than 10% of the population is vaccinated. Is this the new apartheid? I will talk to a South African activist who says yes. Also, I will ask the chairman of Moderna whether his vaccine keeps people safe against the new variant. Then, Moscow versus the West. After a week of much diplomacy by Secretary of State Blinken, can a potential Russian invasion of Ukraine be averted? I will discuss with James Stavridis, NATO's former Supreme Allied Commander. And understanding the new round of nuclear talks in Vienna. As Iran and the U.S. appear miles apart, Washington says it's prepared to use other options if the talks fail. What does this mean? I'll talk to former State Department official Vali Nasser. But first, here's my take. The saddest thing about the emergence of the Omicron variant is its utter predictability. For months, even longer, public health officials have been warning that as long as the COVID-19 virus can circulate freely and widely, it would change its form, and that those mutations could be more difficult to handle than the original variant. In October this year, former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown predicted just this. He said, "We in the West may feel safe and blessed at the moment because we've had the vaccines. But we may find a new variant that comes out of Africa or Asia where people have not been vaccinated and are not protected, and it obviously isn't susceptible to the vaccines that we have at the moment." The solution was also utterly obvious: to vaccinate the rest of the world, and fast. But that never happened, and the resulting disparities are stunning. Close to 70% of the European Union and about 60% of the United States have been fully vaccinated, and yet only about 8% of people in the world's poorest countries have received even one dose. Earlier this year, this failure could be attributed to a problem of production and supply. But the world is now producing 1.5 billion doses of vaccine monthly. The problem has been one of distribution, or to put it bluntly, of the rich world hoarding vaccines at the expense of the poor. According to the health analytics company Airfinity, by the end of March 2022, the G7 and the EU are projected to have a surplus of 880 million vaccines. And this is assuming 500 million more donations to poor countries are made, and every adult in these countries, the G7, the EU, are fully vaccinated plus receiving a booster. It's estimated that 51 million of the doses stored by Western countries will expire and have to be thrown away by the end of this year if they are not used. And yet they sit stockpiled while the poorest 1.6 billion people in the world have about 5% of the world's vaccinations. This is not a case of global institutions failing. There's an effective mechanism to share and distribute the vaccines worldwide, COVAX, set up by a group of international health organizations. But rich countries have been stingy about actually making donations. The US pledged the most, 1.2 billion doses, but so far has delivered just about 280 million. The EU, Iceland, and Norway have collectively pledged about 500 million doses and delivered about 112 million. China has recently increased its pledge to 850 million, up from 100 million, and it has delivered about 89 million. As a result of all this, dozens of countries are at risk of falling short of the WHO's goal of vaccinating 40% of every country's population by December 2021. Which means that the virus will keep replicating and mutating freely among billions of people. What is the chance that we will not see another variant in the next year? Vaccinating the world would be good for the world economy, which mostly means the richest countries that dominate it. In May of this year, the IMF released a proposal that calculated that vaccinating the world by 2022 would cost 50 billion, but a failure to do so could cost the world by 2025 $9 trillion. Put another way, an investment of 0.06% of global GDP could have a 180-fold return on that investment. COVID and public health are not the only areas where we see a self-destructive nationalism at work these days. The hot economic topic is inflation and what is causing it. The Biden administration's COVID relief spending is often blamed for triggering it, and it has almost certainly played some role. Strikingly, though, we see rising inflation almost everywhere, including in countries that did not spend freely after the pandemic. So what could explain this global inflation? Well, protectionist policies like Trump's trade war with China and Biden's Buy American. Former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers wrote, "Tariff reduction is the most important supply-side policy the administration could undertake to combat inflation." The connection between rising protectionism and inflation is obvious. For the last 3 decades, countries have been aggressively sourcing goods from across the world because they are cheaper. Once they began reshoring, finding domestic supplies, and putting in place versions of Biden's Buy American provisions, they are paying more for those same goods. Add to this supply chain disruptions and sudden increases in demands for goods, and you have inflation rising everywhere. Just last week, the Biden administration doubled tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber. So far, the rhetoric of nationalism has been cheap. But as countries have turned that rhetoric into policy, the costs are mounting. They are being felt by the poorest in the world, and they will hurt the working classes in rich countries the most. The answer is obvious: greater global cooperation in public health, trade, and more. But will any national leader dare to say this? Go to cnn.com/Fareed for a link to my Washington Post column.